Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Earl and I will be in the background answering WebEx technical questions. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you experience technical difficulties during the WebEx session, please dial 1-866-779-3239 or you can message me using the Q&A panel. During the presentation, all participants will remain in a listen-only mode, and as a reminder, this event is being recorded. We encourage you to send written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. If it is not visible, it is under the three dots on the bottom right. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send. Please keep the drop-down as all panelists. I would now like to introduce your first speaker today, Ryan Patrick. Ryan, you have the floor.
Thanks, Earl, and welcome everybody. As Earl mentioned, my name is Ryan Patrick, VP of Adoption here at HITRUST. I'm really excited to actually hold this webinar. I think it's somewhat of a long time coming, and we've assembled a pretty interesting group of panelists to discuss really what's going on with the E1, right? So for those of you who are familiar and some who may not be familiar, the E1 came out earlier this year with our new version 11. And it was designed very deliberately to satisfy a few different means and ends within the market based on what HITRUST has seen and what we're hearing and the feedback we're getting from the market. So that's really what we want to cover today, is talking about, what was the original design of the E1? What were we trying to accomplish? What have we learned in the first 9 months or so after its quote unquote birth? So we're going to have some insights coming from Jeremy Hubel from HITRUST. We're also going to talk about some creative use cases, right? So HITRUST had a very specific design in mind, but I think the market has looked at the capabilities of the E1 and applied their own logic and their own business resources and sense and drivers to use it in creative ways. We're also going to talk about market adoption, and we'll get through some Q&A with a couple different perspectives. So I want to introduce our panelists real quick. So first we have Michael Blevins, CIO and co-founder of Health Plan Data Solutions. Ryan George, Senior Director of Information Security from UPMC. As I mentioned, Jeremy Hubel, our Chief Innovation Officer here at HITRUST. And then Mike Parisi, Head of Client Acquisition at Shellman. And I want to pause here for a second because I think it's really interesting the way this panel came together and the dynamic around it. So UPMC, very large healthcare provider in the Northeast and beyond, doing a lot of different work in a lot of ways, providing quality care. But as anybody else in the healthcare industry, or really any industry, they're wrestling with the idea of third-party risk management and how to do that effectively. So Ryan's perspective is going to kind of be that through that lens of an organization relying on the E1 in this specific circumstance to provide third-party assurances from their vendors / third parties. And that's where Michael Blevins comes in. Michael Blevins is actually one of UPMC's vendors and is currently pursuing an E1. So Michael's going to weigh in from the entity being assessed or the organization being assessed against the E1. Obviously, Jeremy is going to talk to us from a HITRUST perspective, and then we have Mike Parisi from Shellman, who is an external assessor. Not only is he the external assessor for Michael at HDS, but he's also the external assessor for UPMC. So Mike is going to talk to us about really what he's seeing in the market, things that are interesting. He'll provide some informational background on what his customers are doing with regards to the E1 in some of those creative use cases, but he's going to weigh in on level of effort, pricing, timing, the whole 9 yards. So without further ado, Jeremy, I want to start off with you. As I mentioned, I wanted to dig into the original design. Like, what was HITRUST thinking when we conceptualized the E1 and how it fit into the larger portfolio? So it's about 9 months old now. Can you weigh in on some of those initial design considerations and kind of where it went from there?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about the E1. It was a labor of love, but HITRUST didn't do it alone. We had discussions with a number of security leaders and stakeholders, both inside the HITRUST ecosystem, as it were, and outside the HITRUST ecosystem. And so my team and I, and Ryan, your team as well, we got on the phone with CISOs. We got on the phone with what we call relying parties, organizations who rely on third-party assurance reports. We got on the phone with external assessors, and we got on the phone with companies who just have this need to demonstrate that they have strong, reliable security. And the more we talked to them, the more we heard that there's still risks from entities that are traditionally considered sort of lower risk in the relative risk spectrum of a third-party sort of supply chain collection of organizations. And the mechanisms, the tools being used to communicate the strength of assurance on those historically, quote, lower risk organizations, they didn't come with a level of assurance, with a level of confidence that what is being communicated matches reality all the time. Like, for example, there's a lot of organizations who say, look, unless you're in my highest tier of sort of vendor risk, you'll get a questionnaire. And like questionnaires have their place, but I want to be able to trust and have assurance and confidence that when someone's communicating to me, yes, I have a perimeter firewall. Yes, I'm locking down access based on least privilege. A little bit more confidence there, right? And so we noted this growing need for a low effort yet reliable cybersecurity assessment and certification that focused on sort of what matters, what's the core foundational cybersecurity practices and the most critical cybersecurity threats. We had this exercise where we went through and said, you know, what is cybersecurity hygiene? What constitutes some foundational cybersecurity controls? And if you ask 10 people, you'll get 100 different answers. We asked close to 100 different people, and we got a lot of different answers. And through conversations with organizations and types of people I mentioned, we worked toward defining sort of what is the core collection of cybersecurity controls that any organization should have, large or small. What's the foundational stuff? And key to the word foundational is that it's built upon. And so if I have a foundation of cybersecurity controls, I can build on that over time, or maybe as my inherent risks increase. And it's that foundational nature of the E1 that we wanted to take advantage of to make sure that if you go from an E1 Essentials 1-year assessment to one of our larger cybersecurity assessments, like the I1 or the R2, that E1 truly is foundational. It's included in those other assessments. So if you think about it like the Russian nesting dolls kind of approach, you've got the E1, the I1, and the R2, and they're all nested inside of each other very intentionally. It's that nesting aspect that we needed to be able to support one of the 2 use cases that we saw for the E1 that we designed very intentionally for the E1. That first use case is to step from one HITRUST assessment to a larger HITRUST assessment to a larger one if you need to over time. Sort of the stepping stone use case. We've got a lot of feedback. Hey, this is really valuable. Why? Because look, if we want to work toward maybe an R2 HITRUST assessment, but we acknowledge we've got a lot of stuff that we have to implement and purchase and build and write policies for before we're even ready to attempt to get that R2 certification. Typically it's like, yep, I'll start on it, and then you wait, right? Relying party, customer is asking for it, you'll wait a little while. Whereas now with the E1 and the I1, the way they're nesting, I can say, yes, I will work toward that R2, or I will work toward that I1. But between now and then, I can get my E1 done. And there's not the risk of controlled jettison just to go from the E1 to the R2, because truly they're nested. So that's a very intentional sort of design goal that we had, and we achieved that. And the other was sort of this concept that the E1 can be the destination, the final assurance report that organizations of specific inherent risk levels and specific kind of IT complexity levels might need. You might not need more than the E1. And so communicating like what type of organization might fit that destination use case, you know, it varies. This is typically talked about relative to other organizations in, like, for example, my vendor's supply chain. But we did acknowledge that there's organizations that maybe don't process a lot of covered information or any covered information, but they still need to demonstrate the strength of their cybersecurity efforts in a reliable manner. that's just more reliable than like a questionnaire can do or design-only assessment can do. And we came up with a lot of potential use cases that could fall into this destination parent use case. And I think we're going to talk about some of those on the webinar. But just to recap, we wanted an assessment that was for sort of the lower tier of sort of organizational IT complexity and IT risk, but was still reliable and still had that quality that HITRUST assessments and certifications are known for. We wanted it to fit well within the assessment portfolio to support that kind of stepping stone. And another really important thing, so we want it to feel like a HITRUST assessment. So it uses all of the different parts of the machinery. So you can still use any one of our external assessors for your E1, for your I1 or your R2. You still use the MyCSF assessment platform. It still uses the HITRUST CSF control framework. So it's got the common components. So truly it's part of the family of HITRUST offerings, but it's not for your sort of higher risk. It's not going to be that destination for your most complex organizations or your most risky vendors, but it has a place, right? Hopefully that's helpful in talking about some of our thinking as we design the E1.
Yeah, I think it was. And I think two things that stuck out for me, Jeremy, was the reliability factor of the E1 and following the same QA process as the historical R2. And secondly, the original idea was based off of feedback from the market. So, all the folks, myself included, who are talking to the market every single day to understand what their challenges are, they're the ones who kind of said, hey, we need this. So interesting to see how this has come to fruition. But I want to kind of jump into, what have we learned at this point, Jeremy? So we have a number of E1s that have come through and have received certification. Is there any tidbits that we can share from the QA process that would be relevant to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say in general, we saw some very positive momentum right out of the gate on the E1, and we're continuing to see that momentum. So there's been many E1 readiness assessments and E1 validated assessments that have been created in our MyCSF assessment platform, and we're still seeing many that continue to be created. So we received our first E1 assessment just a few short months after the announcement, and we continue to receive those for certification consideration. And we have issued several E1 certifications so far. So that's real positive. The momentum, I think people are starting to understand, like you mentioned earlier, so how this tool can fit into their toolbox of communicating the strength of their security program or evaluating sort of the security programs of organizations that are part of their vendor supply chain. So about the organizations that are getting E1 certifications, so almost half of them, not half, but just a hair under half, this is their first HITRUST certification ever. So that's pretty exciting to me for organizations coming in to the E1 ecosystem or the HITRUST ecosystem and understanding, hey, this is something I can get used to here. And if I need to step up as maybe my organization grows, or if I bring on different customers in different industries, I sort of have an assurance continuum that I can progress toward. But starting at the E1, that's pretty exciting to me. Maybe a little under a quarter had at some point tried to do an R2 or done some R2 readiness and understood sort of that level of effort and said, you know what, that level of effort and the accompanying level of stuff I can communicate and the value that the R2 gets, I don't need right now. I think the E1 might be a better fit. But interestingly, it's a mix of organizations across different industries and different sizes. Some are healthcare, not at all. Some are startups, but not all. So yeah, the momentum is there. About the assessments, so pretty much all the E1s that we received have used some kind of inheritance, be it external inheritance or internal inheritance, and that's how HITRUST has worked to solve the problem of shared responsibilities and help communicate assessment results from service providers. And the scopes of E1 assessments are tending to be a little smaller than the typical size of an R2 scope. On average, there's about 2.5 platforms included in the scope of an E1, about 3.5 facilities. And then by way of not applicable requirements, very, very low. I think there's maybe one in-aid requirement on average. The E1 has, I think, 44 requirements, if I remember right. And on average, there's only one coming through as in-aid. That's what we expected. And I think most of them are saying the wireless requirement, hey, this is in-aid because wireless is not in our scope. But feedback from the QA and assurance team, that's the team within HITRUST that is responsible for doing quality reviews of the assessments that we receive for certification consideration. And we do quality reviews, just like our E1 assessment, just like our I1 and R2 assessments, which really are looking at the assessment documentation, the procedures performed by the external assessor, the conclusions reached to be able to have a level of confidence that the information communicated is, is what was validated by the assessor, is truly what the environment supports. And so I talked to every QA analyst who's done any E1 submission, and generally you're saying, hey, it's pretty smooth. It's pretty not a lot of problems. The one piece of feedback that they had, they said the first few that came in, the documentation wasn't as robust as we expected it to be. And in talking to the teams, they thought, well, I didn't think you guys were going to expect as much documentation and screenshots and reports as you would on an R2 or an I1, because this is a different assessment. And we said, well, we're holding it to that same documentation bar, and we're still going to QA it. So it truly is the expectation that you document this assessment like an assessment. And we talked to all the assessors, and ever since then, it's been kind of smooth sailing. So as a result, HITRUST has been able to turn these around really quick, in my opinion. We're averaging less than 30 days from the day that an organization submits an E1 to the day they get their draft report in hand. So that's pretty exciting to me. Yeah, so just some tidbits. The last little tidbit that came out of it was, on average, there's very, very few CAPs, corrective action plans, or gaps, like control deficiencies, in these assessments. And that's kind of intentional as well, the way we designed it. It's a very small assessment. It's your core cybersecurity foundational stuff. And we are certifying this if it meets the bar for certification. And as a result, there's less than one corrective action plan per submission we're seeing on average, and less than one gap we're seeing on average. So to recap, the momentum is there. I think the assessor organizations are kind of understanding and have understood what it takes to document these assessments in the way that they'll get through QA. And I think our turnaround time in QA is reflecting that. And we're able to get draft certification reports and final certification reports in these organizations' hands so they can start using them to communicate the strengths of their cybersecurity program.
Yeah, it's all good news, Jeremy. And I think one other stat that I had heard was it's taking about 100 hours or so for assessors to get through the assessment itself. So it's to the low effort comments that you made, it seems to be on track with that, because in comparison, the R2 is significantly more.
Yeah, well, it depends, any kind of IT assessment, IT audit, there's so many kind of factors that feed into how long it takes. If you have a great big boundary that you're gonna try to certify, that takes longer than a little small boundary. If it's your first assessment ever, like you've never had an ISO assessment, never done PCI, you never done HITRUST, never done SOC 2, that's obviously gonna take longer. So there's levers that kind of like increase or decrease the amount of assessor time. But for the ones that have come into us that have been submitted, we do ask that the assessors kind of describe the amount of time that they took. And on average, we're seeing about 120, 125 hours on the assessor timesheet that we're seeing per these E1s. That's validated, that doesn't include the readiness work, the remediation work. It'll be just that validated assessment kind of window there. And about 40% of the E1s we've received to date, less than 100 hours on that timesheet. And again, for those E1s that we received for the validated, it's about 53 kind of calendar days of that assessor fieldwork window. Again, these are averages. It's hard to draw any one rule that says my E1 will be X hours. And if I get a quote different, that can't be right. Don't draw that. These are generalizations based on averages, so please take them for what they're worth.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Jeremy. I want to move on to Ryan George from UPMC. So you all at UPMC have been, a long time adopter of HITRUST. You found the value in the framework, and you started leveraging it internally, but also for your third-party vendors. How has the E1 changed the game, so to speak, or added additional functionality or capability for the work that you're doing?
That's a great question. So yeah, like you said, we started with HITRUST about I think almost a decade ago. It feels like what's about 6 years ago, we actually got our first validated assessment completed for the full HITRUST assessment. So through that process, we saw how it shaped our cybersecurity program, our privacy program, and how it benefited our organization. So it just made sense for us when we started looking at third-party risks that we would use HITRUST to help us get the level of assurances that we needed. It also helped that our internal users understood HITRUST. Since we already went through HITRUST and they've been part of the assessment internally, when we talked to them about the fact that we were going to ask our third parties to do the same thing and go through a similar process, it made sense and it aligned with everything that we were doing internally. So for us, I mean, third-party risk has been a roller coaster ride lately. We've seen over the last couple of years that almost 90% of new applications that we're acquiring are all going to be in the cloud, right? No, gone are the days where everything we're bringing in-house, or gone are the days everything brought in-house and being done on premise. So we're really transferring the risk from internal to our third-party vendors. So we need to make sure that that the level of assurances go with that. Because the number of breaches are just increasing. We saw the MoveIt breaches this year, not to call them out, but that breach, it was announced in May, and by July there's already 17 million people impacted. And that's just one vendor. And I'm sure everybody out here who has a third-party vendor may have been impacted by that, and it's just the size and scale of it. So we need to find ways to increase our insurances, ensure our third-party programs, or our third parties have a program in place to protect our data. So the E1 made sense, right? Because it's that entry-level assurance program for us. It validates for us that third-party vendor has the most critical cybersecurity controls in place, and that they have that good cyber hygiene. And for us, we also partner with HITRUST Assessment Exchange to help us through that process. We have hundreds of third-party vendors that we deal with, and so for my internal team, it was a lot of work just to get all these third parties to go through this process. So partnering with the HITRUST, the HACS team, they're basically acting as an extension of our team, and they're reaching out and having their third-party vendors do an inherent risk questionnaire up front, and then doing the E1 self-assessment. But then we can take both of those questions and those responses for both of those, the questionnaire as well as the self-assessment. We can take that and we can communicate the risk back to our business owners to help them make decisions on how to move forward with that third-party vendor.
Yeah, I think one thing that you and I had talked about previously was how the E1 kind of opened up your ability to look at more vendors, right? Because before the E1 came out, you were only really looking at critical vendors. It was really hard to use the R2 for anybody less than the highest risk vendors. So I thought that was really interesting. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's been the biggest challenge for us, is just the scale of our third-party vendors. So, as we had to be creative. It wasn't really clear who all our third-party vendors were at first. And so we've been discovering new third-party vendors. We have a big research arm too. So, there's not everybody goes through supply chain, right? There's different ways that people can acquire and share data with third parties. So once we started to get a handle on that, the number of third-party vendors flooding in was significant. And so for us to be able to do that assessment and communicate that risk back to our business owners, we needed help in that, and we needed a concrete process that was efficient to do the assessment and get that information back to our business owners, because they can't wait 2-3 months for us to get back to them on a risk assessment, right? There's just too much going on, and so we can't slow them down. And so the process that we've established helped us, do the turnaround. As long as the vendor does their part and does self-assessment and completes that and gets it back to the HACS team, we're turning this around in under 10 days, and sometimes even quicker, just depending on how cooperative the third-party vendors are.
Mike Parisi, that is. So Shellman does work really in all industries. So I'm interested in your perspective in how the E1 is being received in the market. Is there general excitement about it? Is there acceptance of it from, parties who are looking for assurances?
You hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yes, so there's actually been an uptick, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 months of acceptance from a relying party perspective. And there's a lot of organizations that are pursuing it for the first time, I think similar to Jeremy's comments before, right? A lot of organizations that are going through the E1, they haven't tried to go down the HITRUST path at all before. They've thought about it, but they've looked at it as you would say, right, a significant emotional event, right? So the result, they kind of put the brakes on, they didn't go through it. We are seeing a movement in what I like to call racking and stacking certifications, right? So there's a lot of organizations that maybe have, you know, your run-of-the-mill SOC 2. It has its place, as we know, in the marketplace, but it doesn't have the same level of transparency that, say, a HITRUST certification has. Or maybe they have a standard ISO 27001 certification, right? A lot of the things that are standard in the marketplace. And what we're trying to do is, if you look at your dance card of certifications and assessments that organizations have, how quote unquote easy is it to add, say, an E1 on top of what you're already doing? And as a result, we're seeing a lot of organizations move in that direction because the level of effort is actually very low relative to what they're already doing. I mean, most organizations have some type of information security program in place. And again, as you and Jeremy like to say, when we think about the E1, you know, these are requirements that if you're not fulfilling those, you should be seriously reconsidering what you're doing in your life because it's not significant, right? From a level of effort perspective, it is table stakes. So recently we've seen a lot of organizations move in that direction, not only because it's easier to achieve, but also because the lift relative to what they're already doing is much smaller compared to, say, an R2 as an example.
Yeah, so just to piggyback off the comment you made, not significant in the level of effort, but significant in reducing potential impacts because these are, as you said, table stakes, right?
Correct. That's right. Yep.
So Michael, HDS is on the 5-yard line at this point with an E1 assessment. So I want to get your perspective on, you know, what are your initial impressions of effort, that the process, the timeline, things that you think the audience, those out there that may be thinking about pursuing the E1 or leveraging it, any interesting perspective based on what you've seen so far? You're on mute, Michael.
Hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yes, sir.
So I like the E1 program for a couple reasons. One is it highlights just the basic foundation that every company should pursue to their cyber or their security program. It's and the reason, and it removes some of the I guess some of the roadblocks to moving to an I1 or an R2 assessment. I mean, if you look at an R2 assessment, it's pretty daunting. And if you've never gone through any type of assessment or just have done self-assessments, it's pretty daunting to strive for that HITRUST certification. So I see the E1 as the foundational, like Jeremy was explaining, and it's that first step to the next step. And of course, whether you need to take that next step or not really depends on the industry that you're in and what, you know, what's necessary for your business. But we're seeing. I was very pleased with the process. Shelman has been a great partner in leading us through that. Our remediation was pretty small because being in the business of pharmacy data and patient data, we've been really concerned over the evolution of our company, that the security was we really need to focus on that. But just the the foundational aspect and just the core security controls highlighted in E1 was something that was really I think is really a good step for folks going down this, or companies going down this path. So.
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of the readiness and remediation stuff. So question for you, Michael, and for you, Mike. Is there this element of, anticipation of a lot of readiness and remediation work, or are we starting to feel like it's not as, Michael, I think, as you said, daunting in getting prepared to go down the E1 path? And either one of you chime in, please.
Well, I'll answer that. I might not be as positive, or my outlook might not be as bright that companies are paying enough attention to what they need to pay attention to get over to even get an E1. So it really depends on where you currently are as far as in your security program. So even if you're not as mature as you should be, I think the lift to get to that, the remediation period is going to be much shorter than trying to do an R2 assessment. So what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Michael nailed it, where what we see, in the SKUs and SKUs of E1s that we've done as an assessor, that the majority of the requirements they're meeting, right? And there may be a handful of those where there's some remediation that needs to occur. So I think, to Michael's point, it is, a little daunting to think about how many organizations aren't even doing the essentials, right? But that is the case. And I think going through this exercise, it helps organizations identify what are those essentials from a remediation perspective. But most of them have their shop in order, right? I think the other thing that's important to note, again, back to what we've talked about for years, right, at HITRUST, is that this is not that big of a lift, and it really does position you for success in the future. So if you look at somebody like UPMC, right, and what Ryan and the folks at UPMC are asking organizations to do, it's really table stakes, right? And this idea of self-attested to pencil whip questionnaires, that's not going to be sufficient enough anymore. And we're all fooling ourselves if we think that that's giving us the appropriate level of transparency. So when we go through the process, we're finding that most organizations, even through the answering of the questionnaire, understand what these requirements are. It's just a question of, do they have the appropriate evidence in place from a validation perspective to satisfy those requirements?
Yeah, makes sense. And it's in line with the feedback that I've heard from folks and having discussions kind of generally every single day, not only from an assessed entity perspective, but also with our external assessor community.
And I'll add a little bit, Ryan, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, based on what I've heard internally, or anecdotally, I guess, about sort of what types of requirements somebody coming under an E1 might have had to do a little bit of work on to get ready for that validated assessment. It's I guess to be expected that the sort of the run-of-the-mill IT general control kind of stuff, most organizations have, like, I'm going to limit user access. I'm going to approve new users before they get access. I'm going to remove access whenever it's people leave, just to focus on that one domain. But there are other requirements in here that we consider foundational cybersecurity stuff, not because they are run-of-the-mill IT general controls, but because they are necessary to respond to active and really important threat activity that's out there right now. So you'll see in the list of E1 requirements, there are things that are about phishing. There are things that are about ransomware. And some of these things that are so critical now, like train your users about phishing and have offline backups to help protect against ransomware and limit the impact of ransomware if something happens there. Those are the kind of the requirements that I'm hearing. You know, actually we had to do a little bit of work there to be able to get that in place. Not the the regular IT general controls that might have been tested 100 times by a SOX auditor or a SOC 1 or SOC 2 or whatever. It's these other ones that are sort of roped in because of the threat adaptive nature of the E1, which is great, right? Because you want to be able to say, you know what, there is a threat out there, and this is a really important key control to help protect against that threat or limit the impact of if that bad thing happens. Actually, we did need that. So hopefully there's value coming out of not only being able to have it just to prove you got the cert, but to actually raise the bar and make sure you're addressing the current and emergent threats.
Well, I just want to say something about that. So just to expand on that. So, Ryan was right. I mean, it's no longer, you're no longer just having your data sitting in your data center under lock and key. I mean, we're using data on the web. We're sharing more data between companies, and it's important that if it's important, there's two things. One, if you're running a good cyber program, you want the companies you're doing business with to know that and understand that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. But two, we need to be able to rely on each other, and companies that we're the receiver of a lot of data, and companies need to understand that they're protected, and they need to feel that confidence, or we can't do business, or they don't want to do business. So so being able to demonstrate through an E1 assessment that you have the controls in place is really important to doing business, just doing business. So it's not going to go away. It's going to be more and more important.
I totally agree with that. Ryan, George, I want to pivot to you for a second. And my next question is kind of in line with a question we had coming through the Q&A box. But as mentioned, UPMC is leveraging the full HITRUST portfolio to manage third parties. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts that you'd like to share with those out there who are trying to figure out how to manage their third parties and potentially use the portfolio?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, we first start off with asking. We have an onboarding questionnaire for our internal business owner to tell us about their vendor, who the contacts are, and their understanding of that relationship. What type of data that we're going to be sending to them, and what type of services they're providing, et cetera. And then we move that information gets shared with the hacks team, and then they reach out to the vendor and do the inherent risk questionnaire that talks about similar questions, especially including questions around like how they're going to manage their data, what's the backup strategy look like, what laws and regulations or do they believe they have to adhere to when it comes to data retention, which is to me is very important. And then also going on to doing the E1. So we take all that information and we take a step back and we look at the risk that presented in front of us, and based on that, we communicate to the vendor and to our internal business owner that the level of assurance that we need for that vendor, right? So based on, as I mentioned, the data classification, number of unique records, how they're handling our data and retention policies, we slot them into requiring them to get the E1 validated, the I1, or the R2. And again, it just all aligns with the level of assurances that we need. Now, that information, we also include that since we're trying to do this up front before we even authorize our business owners start business with that vendor. We introduce that language into our contracts, and we set a timetable that when we expect the vendor to achieve those levels of certification. And so if we say we want them to do an R2, there's a path, right? We're following HITRUST's guidance on this and saying, okay, you start with, you did the E1 to start off. We expect you to have an I1 to say, I think it's like 18 months. And then another, 2 years after that, we expect to see you get to an R2. We understand that it's not easy just to go from 0 to an R2. It's very difficult, right? There's a lot of maturity that often have to happen internally in order to reach that. So we recognize that. So we build that into our contracts, and we associate penalties if those conditions aren't met. and we communicate very clearly with our vendors our expectations. And so I think having that tiered approach and working with your vendors and setting those timelines, I think works for both sides, right? You go into it understanding that it's not easy to achieve, but in the end we both win, because we're getting, we're going to have a relationship that hopefully can last, and they can provide the services that we're signing them up for, and then we have those assurances that they're keeping our data safe in the meantime.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know there's going to be this question, if it's not already being typed at the moment. I want to go to Mike Parisi. So every day I'm asked around, pricing. How do I, what's the cost to go through HITRUST assessments, so on and so forth. Based on the work that Shelman has done to this point with E1s, what can people expect from a price perspective to get through the whole process?
Yeah. Of course, I need to say it depends, because we wouldn't be an auditor if we didn't say that. But that being said, I would say it's significantly lower than, honestly, any other type of attestation that we do in the marketplace, right? Even SOC 2. It is cheaper to go through any one, especially if you already have an information security program in place, than it is to do a SOC 2, just to kind of set the stage, right? As an example. What we're seeing is, if an organization has some type of an established information security program in place, we're able to get through it within under 10 business days, right? So under 2 weeks. If they have nothing in place, you might be looking at 3 weeks worth of time, assuming there isn't, a significant level of remediation that needs to occur. But, we just launched a program actually for any UPMC vendors where we're discounting our services for anybody that's a UPMC vendor relative to the E1 readiness and ultimately the validation. So if somebody is coming to you and saying that an E1 is costing like $40,000 or $50,000 in terms of level of effort, they're crazy, because it should not cost that much. There's some E1s that we're doing, again, depending upon how much an organization has in place relative to their information security program. We're doing it for under 10 grand, right? If we're already doing their SOC 2, for example, if we're already doing their ISO certification. So, the costs, of course, every firm's going to be different, but the parameters I would put in place is, if somebody's telling an organization that this is a $40,000, $50,000 investment relative to professional services, go talk to somebody else, right? Is what I would encourage them to do. At the same time, if they're saying they can do it for $2 or $3 grand, they probably also don't know what they're talking about, right? So it is, relatively speaking, a lower level of effort and investment compared to other assurance mechanisms that are out there. And right now we're averaging, as I mentioned, two weeks worth of time, cradle to grave, right? So starting with the scoping, actually asking for the documentation, the validation, and then submission to HITRUST. And the other thing I would mention, and this is, a testament right to you and Jeremy, is that HITRUST is cranking through these things, right? I mean, they're getting through QA quick and turning them around very, very quickly. So that's also helping us on the back end to get somebody from readiness to actual validation to certification within a short period of time.
I appreciate that, Mike. I know it's a difficult question to answer, very black and white, but it wouldn't be me if I didn't put you on the spot and force you to at least articulate that. So, I really quick, we have about 15 minutes left, 14 minutes left. We have a couple more topics or questions that we're going to get through, but if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A so we can get to them towards the end. So with that said, Jeremy, what are any final thoughts on, you know, where HITRUST is going with the E1 and or the CSF, right? So I personally think one of the more compelling elements of the E1 and by extension the I1 and the R2 is the threat adaptive nature of the control set. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what I'm referring to, Jeremy can probably articulate it pretty quickly, but we will cover this ad nauseum at our annual conference, which is a shameless pitch that I will throw out there. But it's really innovative, and it's really, I don't want to say revolutionary, because it's, you would think every assurance mechanism should do these things, but it's really compelling stuff in my mind, the threat adaptive nature of the control set. Do you see anything like that coming for the E1? Anything we can expect to see coming out of HITRUST in the future?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's two questions there. What's going on with where we're taking the framework and where we're taking the E1? And I can fill an hour on where the framework is going, because it is a dynamic framework. You know, we constantly respond to changes in the underlying authoritative sources that we map, and we constantly challenge ourselves. Are we setting the right bar? And we constantly bring in new authoritative sources. Like, for example, right now we're working on bringing in some AI-focused authoritative sources, like the AI risk management framework from NIST. We're mapping in really soon here. So the framework, there's always a lot going on with it, and I think that's a good thing. People might say, you know, it's a moving target. Well, not really. We've designed the assurance mechanism so that you can target your assessment on a particular version, and you've got the ramp to get there, and we can iterate the other versions, and it's not like you're trying to chase this ever-moving bar. But we do update the framework. Now, where we're going on the E1 itself, we respond to our quarterly threat intelligence feed, and quarterly, well, it's an ongoing feed. It's a quarterly threat intelligence analysis. And what I mean by that is we have a threat-informed control selection process. So those familiar with threat-informed defense, it's more of a SOC, like Security Operations Center topic, than it is a GRC topic. But we do ingest threat intelligence, and we look to try to understand what is happening by way of threat actors and the techniques and tactics that they are using to try to break through defenses. Like, what are the bad guys doing, and what's leading to breaches, and which controls are necessary to try to prevent or detect or correct the most prevalent threat activity. And it's an ongoing thing that we do every quarter. We post blog posts about it, describe it. But the E1 will not stay 44 requirements forever. That doesn't mean it'll continue to increase over time, because it could decrease. But there is part of the E1 that is in because ransomware is hot, phishing's hot, other like privilege escalation's hot. So there's requirements in for that. But if those kind of top threats, most prevalent threats change over time, you expect to see the E1 requirements that change with it. And like I said, it's not only adding, we could be sunsetting requirements as stuff that's hot now is not hot in the future. So it truly is this threat-informed selection. So you can't expect the E1 to change as a result. We're also evaluating feedback from organizations to say, look, I want to do the E1, but I want to add an authoritative source to that and do a combined assessment. I want to do an E1 and a HIPAA privacy at the same time. Can we do it? Well, not right now. Right now, the R2 assessment is where you can add optional authoritative sources. So we're kind of fielding feedback to say, you know, how possible would it be to be able to add authoritative sources to the E1 and the I1, just like the R2? And what could the outputs look like? Would they be the same reports, separate reports? So we're having conversations like that as well. But it's exciting to be able to hear market feedback about how people are using the E1. And for those on the call, as always, if there's a brilliant idea, or you've had a success story in using it, or you had a near success because it almost did something, that we would love that feedback, especially myself and the innovation team. But yeah, it's a dynamic product, as is the framework. It's a dynamic control framework.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Jeremy. So we do have a couple questions that came through. The one I'll jump to first is, and I may actually start to answer it, but anybody else on the panel who wants to chime in, feel free to. Are we seeing any pushback from covered entities or other BAs to accept the E1? There's, hearsay that there are entities out there who are not accepting of it. So I'll chime in. So as a general rule, there likely is some organizations who have their own proprietary mechanisms to evaluate risk and garner assurances. So I don't want to stand here and make you think that everybody across the U.S. healthcare industry is accepting of anything from HITRUST or anything for that matter, because they may have their own proprietary questionnaire. For the organizations that currently are asking their third parties to either get HITRUST certified or as an option get HITRUST certified, we have seen really no pushback from these entities as long as the inherent risk is appropriate. So if you are a high risk vendor to a very large payer and you try to feed them or give them an E1 certification, they may say, no, we're not going to accept the E1 because we feel that you are such high risk to us, we want the R2. So that's the majority of the use cases that I've seen. There are some use cases where we have gotten involved in the conversation with that, what we call relying party, the party that is relying on HITRUST as an assurance mechanism to help them educate that team on what the E1 is and what it isn't and how it fits in within their current third-party risk management program and risk triage methodology. And typically those issues are resolved after that conversation. So, so much so that we're having this webinar, there's still a lot of education that has to happen within the U.S. healthcare industry around what the E1 is. I mean, there are some organizations that don't know what it is. They don't know how many controls there are. They don't know that it goes through the same rigor and provides the same reliability as an R2 assessment with just different risk profiles. So if you're having pushback or you're getting pushback, do not hesitate to reach out to me or someone else at HITRUST. We are happy to engage and advocate and educate organizations to understand what HITRUST brings to the table. Any other comments from any of the other panelists?
Yeah, I'll chime in, right. I think, we're not seeing it not be accepted. There are some instances where it's not the destination, right? So some organizations are saying, I am going to need more than just the E1 at some point. But when you talk through the journey, if you will, right, or as we like to say, moving along the assurance continuum, as you educate, and as we do every day, as you educate relying parties on, look, this is better than a questionnaire, right? Like, something is not being self-attested to. We understand that you want the biggest scoped assessment that you can possibly get and the highest level of transparency, but it's going to take time for organizations to get there from a maturity perspective. So I say all that to say that we're not seeing any relying parties say, we will not accept the E1, period. They may say, we'll start with the E1, and that's much better than what we're getting today, which is probably nothing, or maybe just a SOC 2, for example, right? And this is a higher level of transparency. But there is an expectation that you will continue to improve and provide us an additional level of transparency from an assessment perspective in the future.
Great, thanks, Mike. Jeremy, I think the next question comes to you. Have there been any issues related to the carve-out approach being used with the E1?
Yeah, great question from Andrea, I think. So the E1 and the I1 both allow carve-outs where the R2 doesn't. Some people on the call know. And what we're talking about is if there is a requirement or control performed by an outsourced service provider, like a cloud service provider, for example, or a colo provider. On the R2 world, there is no way to say, it's not in our scope because we can't get assurances, therefore we're just going to mark this one NA. Can't do it on the R2. On the E1 and I1, the assurance program requirements at HITRUST do allow you to say, I'm going to take a carve-out approach and say, you know what, this is out of my scope because the control is performed by somebody else. We allow it, but, and this is true for the E1 and the I1 both, even though we allow it, it's very rare in our experience so far for the E1 and I1 for anyone to actually take the carve-out approach, which is great from an assurance perspective, because if you can communicate the strength of that control's performance, regardless of who's performing it, and it's relevant to the scope of the assessment, that's awesome. It's better than saying, I don't know if that control is being performed. You get to say, yes, and here's the score. That control is being met by my cloud service provider. And I'm speculating now, but I think the carve-outs approach is used a lot less in the HITRUST world than it is maybe in the SOC 2 world, is because we have a solution. We have this electronic workflow that lets you inherit from all these big outsourced IT services providers and cloud service providers. So it's almost as easy to say, yep, I'm going to inherit from GCP or AWS, Microsoft, and get that score that they tested that somebody locked the data center door, for example. It's almost as easy as typing out, this is not applicable because the cloud service provider is doing it. So we're not seeing issues because we're not really seeing the carve-outs being used.
Jeremy, I think you're being too kind. So I completely agree with you. We're not seeing anybody in at least from our perspective, right? As an assessor, nobody's even asking about the carve-out approach at all. And when you think about, you know, the SOC 2 and really any SOC report, right? SOC 1, SOC 2, of course, there's significant carve-outs. I mean, nobody does the inclusive method. I mean, out of our thousands of clients, I think we literally have like 2 that do the inclusive method on the SOC reports. But nobody's even really entertaining all the E1s that we've done. Nobody's entertained or done the carve-out approach because they understand the importance of providing transparency relative to the fourth parties, right, for the relying parties in terms of what's going on, which is very unique from a HITRUST perspective, as we all know. And we actually advise our clients to not use the carve-out approach, even for an E1.
I think it adds to the assurance that you get out of it. You get more information,
Right.
more meaningful information. So I think that's a great strategy. Mike, thanks for sharing that.
All right, we are just about at time. If we did not get to your questions, we will be sure to follow up with you after the webinar closes within the next couple of days. I did want to quickly talk about our annual conference that's coming up in just about 2 weeks or so. So it's the 3rd through the 5th with some pre-conference workshops happening on the 2nd. It's in Grapevine, Texas, so just over the fence, if you will, from DFW. Some of the topics that we're going to talk about there, I kind of alluded to the threat adaptive nature of the assessment portfolio. There's going to be lots of stuff on that. We're going to talk about cyber insurance. We're going to hear from cyber insurance companies. They're going to be on stage talking about what they're seeing from a cyber insurance perspective, lessons learned, how to leverage your HITRUST work within the application or renewal process to hopefully gather or receive better terms. We're going to be talking to state ramps. So if you're an organization that is doing work at the state level, there is a pilot going on with state ramps. So we'll get into that. We're going to be talking about AI, whole lot of stuff. Feel free to scan that QR code and we'll see you there. So I want to thank our panelists, Michael, Jeremy, Mike, and Ryan for joining me today. I really appreciated the conversation. If there's any other questions, feel free to email me at any time, ryan.patrick@hitrustalliance.net. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you for attending today's session. This concludes today's webinar. You may disconnect your lines.